Hi, this is Jason Martin. You're listening to Banding with AMZY.
What's up, everybody? It's Sean from AMZY, and on this episode, I sit down with music extraordinaire, Jason Martin. Jason is a VP of promo at Atlantic Music Group, and he is also a co-manager at a boutique management company called March Artist Management. I sat with Jason in his basement over some tequila and whiskey, and we had a long conversation about streaming, the future of music and radio, and being true to yourself as an artist. So let's just get to it. I hope you all enjoy. So let's start with just your story. Where did you grow up? How did you get into music? And then after that, we'll get into how you got into the industry.
It all starts with "This Is the End" from The Doors. I shit you not.
Really?
Yeah. So when I was 10 years old, my mom took my brother and I to go see Apocalypse Now in 1979. And she thought it'd be a good idea to take our sons to a war movie. And she didn't realize it was like some sort of crazy mind fuck of a movie. And it was. And it opens with "This Is the End" from The Doors. There's this crazy napalm scene, right?
Yeah,
all these
totally.
palm trees light up, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was cool. I loved the music interaction with the film. I thought that was amazing. And then as the film goes on, it has a great music score, right? So it has like Satisfaction from Rolling Stones and everything else. There's some Hendrix in there, I think. But my mom had all those records, and so I went home after the movie and I just started pulling all these records out that my mom had, and she just had this cool. It wasn't a huge collection, but it was a cool enough collection, right? So she had some Beatles, Stones, Doors, Who, Zeppelin, and so I gravitated towards Zeppelin because she had Zeppelin 1 and 2 in there, and so I've just listened to those over and over again, and then I went out and bought Zeppelin 4. But the first record I ever actually bought, shortly after that movie, I was 10 or 11, I bought Van Halen 1, which at the time was like 4 years old because that record came out in 77, so it was only 3
Wait, that came out in 77?
Yeah, and if you listen to that record, it sounds amazing to this day. It still holds up. And yeah, it's hard to believe that record, that band was that old. But they've obviously been around forever. And so I just really started just diving into music at that early age, and really compelled to just listen to music over and over, everything. And then when I was like 12, 13 years old, I started going to concerts. My mom was a waitress at a fish restaurant near downtown, or in downtown San Diego, but near the sports arena, the San Diego sports arena, where all the big concerts were. And back then, a concert was like $15. You can get a ticket and a T-shirt for like $22. And I wasn't buying beer, but that was probably $1.50 back then. And so she would drop me and my buddies off on our way to work. She'd go to work at 5. She'd drop us off like 4:30, and then she'd pick us up when she got off work at midnight. So we'd just go to the sports arena and hang out. We were the youngest kids there. Everyone was just getting fucking hammered.
There was no age limit then?
No. I mean, there were really, on major arena shows, there's never an age limit.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
So I wasn't hanging out at bars. That came later, like the punk rock bars and stuff like that when I got older. But so we would go see, the Kinks or Judas Priest or Dio, Aerosmith, Kiss, Wasp, Queensryche. I mean, all that shit. I'd go to all those shows in the early 80s, all those hard metal shows.
Did you see the original Kiss lineup?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, that's rad.
Yeah, with like Ace and... What do you mean by original?
Ace, Paul Stanley, Peter Criss, Gene Simmons.
Yes, the original lineup, yes. And the first time I saw them, it was the Animalized Tour, which is, I think, the only tour, or maybe one of 2 tours that they did with no makeup.
Yeah, and then like
so
right
like in
after
82 or 83, maybe 84, they decided to not wear makeup.
Yeah.
And then they did a tour. They put a record out called Animalized. And then that record was horrible. And then they went back to makeup because that's kind of their shtick. I mean, they don't really write a lot of great songs. So anyway, so growing up, I was always consuming music. And back then it was on albums, or cassettes, and you would you would download. Fuck, you would you would record a cassette from the album because you didn't want to burn your album out, right? So you would record it on a cassette, and then you'd play the cassette over and over again. And then if you burnt that out, you just re-record it. So you try to save your LPs as long as possible.
That's genius.
Because I didn't have like a hi-fi, super dope turntable. I had like an old shitty turntable. So, just constantly consuming music. Friends would trade cassettes, and and then just kind of kept with it. And around 86, 87, maybe 85, started getting into alternative music. Got out of like metal. Right, like when Master Puppets came out. So it was like 85 or 86, I think, when Master Puppets came out. Listened to that, and then just kind of transitioned to alternative music. And
how old were you then?
I was 86. Or 85. I was 16.
Okay, so you were in like the perfect age for that type of music.
Yeah, I mean, being born in the late 60s. I was in the perfect age for the 80s.
Yeah.
Right? So I started high school in 83. I ended in 87.
Yeah.
I started in radio in 88, like shortly after high school. I got a job out in the middle of the desert at this top 40 radio station called Hot Hits Q96, KSIQ.
Okay, so that kind of leads me to my next question. That's how you got into the music business, was radio?
Correct. Yeah. So right out of high school, I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't go to college. No one in my family had ever gone to college. Actually, Jack, my son, is the only kid to ever go to college in my family, and no one else. And
yeah, Jack.
And I was actually the first person to graduate high school in my family, so it wasn't a big priority in my family to go. It was just assumed that I would get into doing labor work, construction, whatever, which I did. I built cabinets in high school. I cleaned boats in high school. I extracted honey from beehives in high school, or right before high school, actually. I was in the 8th grade going into 9th grade when I did that job. That sucked.
Did you wear the beekeeper suit and everything?
No, we didn't get a beekeeper suit. We had like it was me and my buddy, and they would put all those white boxes you see along the freeway, along rural road, out in the middle of nowhere, right? Yeah. So each one of those boxes has 10 different slats in it. Each one of those slats you have to pull up, cut the cells open, the honey pours out. You put it in a centrifuge to kind of get the honey to separate out. We do about 2 tons of honey a day. And so these boxes are called supers, and they'd be in a room. Majority of the bees would be dead, but we would get stung every single day because there's still thousands of bees flying around you. Pissed.
Yeah. You're stealing their honey.
Yeah, and so we got stung every single day. So anyway, started doing radio out in the do we have to stop? So I started doing radio out in the middle of the desert. So right out of high school, I ran into this audio engineer who was a teacher at a community college, and we started talking. He's like, well, what do you want to do? I go, I'd love to be a disc jockey. And he's like, well, I do engineering. I go out every 6 months to this radio station out in the middle of the desert, and I know he's always looking for overnight guys because no one will work in the middle of the fucking desert on the Mexican-American border, like literally like Sicario shit, like in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
120 miles from downtown San Diego. Like right across the border, right there in this little town called Mexicali, right?
Oh, I've heard of Mexicali.
Right. So Brawley, El Centro, Mexicali, there's this like 3 little towns that are right next to each other. And so I went out there, got an interview, started doing overnights, 10P to 6A. So I'd drive out there and drive home for $5 an hour. And it was like, this was 88. It was May 6, 1988. And it was pre Red Bull, pre Monsters, none of that shit. The only thing we had was to keep us awake was No-Dos and Jolt Cola, which Jolt advertised. Their advertisement was all the sugar and twice the caffeine, and that was how they advertised their cola, right? So I'd drive into the desert. I'd pick up a 6-pack of Jolt Cola before my shift, and a sandwich, and I'd just do these crushing overnight shifts. I was a horrible fucking DJ, but 6 months later, I got a job at 91X, which was like, at the time, one of only 6 radio stations in the entire country that was a commercial alternative radio station. There wasn't even a commercial alternative chart back then. They were just lumped into the college radio chart. And got a job there, and that was like the station I grew up listening to. They flipped in like 83. I was kind of listening to that way. I still listen to metal music. And got a job there, and then like in 90, doing production, commercials, voiceover, writing, shit like that. And, you know, all these label reps would come by and bring artists by. And I thought that was like so cool because I always wanted a job that would let me travel. Yeah. Was kind of my big thing. Like I love music, but I also wanted something that would let me travel. And I see these guys traveling all the way down from LA to San Diego, all 90 miles. But they would bring the coolest artists by. And so I'd get to know some of the artists. And I remember like, you know, some incredible meetings with artists. And I was, you know, 19, 20. I just turned 21 when I was there. And I decided that I wanted to do records because I was a terrible DJ. I was horrible at fucking radio. And I just felt like maybe records was where I wanted to be. And I wanted to be close to the artist too. Yeah. Because when you're radio, you're not really close to the artist. Like they come in, you do an interview, and then they split. You're not really running with the artist, not really hanging with the artist.
Radio feels kind of isolated to me from what I've seen.
It is, and a lot of it is because you have to self-isolate, right? Yeah. Because you can't play everyone's single. So Nerf is an exception because he becomes very tight with these artists. Yeah. But he's also very disciplined in that he knows that at the end of the day, he has to play records at test.
Yeah, and I feel like Nerf does a good job of walking the line between knowing the artist, you know, even just on a local level and like being friends and knowing what his obligations are.
Right. If it was up to Nerf, he would play every single Rise Against song, but he hasn't had a Rise Against song test in like 6 years. So he can't play him.
Yeah. What about the one that's in there right now?
Yeah, we'll see how it's doing. We'll see how it's doing. If he's playing it, it must be testing, but yeah, he's very leery of any like guitar-driven songs because they just generally don't test, you know, and all the stuff that used to test for him back in the early 2000s and mid-2000s, guitar-driven music, it doesn't work anymore.
That's sad.
For him.
Okay, for 93.3 in particular?
Right, for KTCL 93.3 in particular, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work at other stations. So when you're looking at the radio, every alternative station is a little different. Some are more pop, alternative driven, like AMZY fits right in the pocket. Other stations still lean more active rock, and they play more aggressive guitar driven rock.
Okay. Is there like pockets of like specifically in the country that's like more rock driven? Like is the South more rock driven?
You know what? It really all depends. It's more it's not cut into like geographic regions as much as kind of cities. Okay. And I found that like the stations that are like more rock driven, like in Houston, the Buzz in Houston is more rock driven. That station is more rock driven because they're the only station in town that plays anything rock leaning at all, because there is no active rock station in that market. So because of that, they can super serve a broader audience by playing rock stuff and still kind of get away with the pop alternative stuff. They play less pop alternative, but they still play a lot of rock. And like the recurrents are like grunge, you know, all guitar driven stuff.
Okay. Like, how about you just, for everybody listening, just explain what you do now?
Which job? The management job or the label job?
Start with the label job and then the management job.
The label job, I'm vice president of radio promotion for Atlantic Music Group, and I handle all Fueled by Ramen acts, which include Panic at the Disco, 21 Pilots, Paramore, Young the Giant, a lot of stuff like that. Vinyl Theater is one of our newer bands. And then I also deal with pop radio there as well as a national. So I deal with, like bands like Clean Bandit and Christina Perri and Jason Mraz and, Cash Cash, which had one big decent song, and acts like that. And I used to deal with, prior to that, I dealt with a lot of the active rock bands, so like Slipknot, Nickelback, Theory of a Dead Man, Stone Sour, et cetera, et cetera. And so basically my job is, on the label side, is like I'm a lobbyist. I walk into radio stations and I lobby programmers, decision makers who put music on. And I lobby them to get my records on versus this other label's records. And I also, when an artist is touring, whenever they're in my territory, we're kind of responsible for that artist when it comes to interviews, meet and greets, any special promotions we do, stage announcements, all that stuff. So we coordinate and set all that up with the radio stations and the artist.
Okay. So how did you initially get into that? I mean, we kind of went into it, but how did you?
Yeah, going back to it. So in like 91, when I'd done radio for about 3 years, I decided that I wanted to do records, and I just called the 3 label people in LA that I knew the best. And the first one called me back. You know, he offered me an internship because I said I didn't want a job. I just wanted an internship because I wanted to get up there. And he's like, yeah, man, when can you be here? And it was on a Friday when I called him. And I go, when do you want me? He goes, can you be here by Thursday? I'm like, yeah, I'll be there. And I literally quit my job, told my girlfriend I was moving to LA. I had run into a really good friend of mine from high school, this guy Mitch Collins, who was going to UCLA. And he was at a friend of ours was in a band called Honey Glaze, and they happened to be playing that night at the Casbah, which is like a pretty classic place in San Diego. The original Casbah, which only holds 80 people. The new one holds like 300 people, I think.
Is that the Casbah from the song Rock the Casbah? From
No,
okay.
That was long before.
Okay.
The Clash's Rock the Casbah was long before that. But yeah.
Okay.
And that was based on the 70s oil shortages and how we're, we're basically beholden to Arab countries. They kind of had the what's the term I'm looking for? The first world, not first world, but European and American countries, they held them by the balls because they controlled all the oil. So the Clash wrote that song about the Casbah. So records, Tom Kenny was this guy, Rhino, calls me back. Rhino at the time was, the reissue label, the funky reissue label, but they had just started a new artist division called RNA, Rhino New Artist. And we had some artists signed that were like alternative college sounding artists like Chris Holzapfel, Peter Stamey, Exene Cervenka, Steve Wynn, artists that no one's ever heard of or very few people have heard of. And so I just started there as an intern, and I worked at a record company at night, and my 1971 VW bus blew up a month after I moved there, so I had to ride my bike all over LA, which sucked.
So you just quit your job. Did you have any money at all, or you just quit and just...
I didn't make... at radio, I was making $5.15 an hour, so I probably had a couple of $100 savings, and that was it.
Yeah.
I loaded my VW bus up with everything I owned, which was literally 2 surfboards, a mountain bike, a box of books, a box of records, a record player, and some clothes. And that was everything I had.
That's pretty rock and roll.
Yeah. So
speaking of boxes.
Yeah, speaking of boxes. Young Jack Martin carrying a big box. He got some muscles. So yeah, that was, and I just moved to LA and started meeting other people, and then moved to Boulder after the riots. So I was there for the LA riots.
That was like
92 and didn't leave until 93, like August 93. Okay. So I moved to Colorado August 1st, 1993.
Just because of the LA riots?
Because I wanted to get out of LA. Yeah, I didn't like living in LA at all.
Yeah.
I met a lot of great people in LA, but I just really couldn't get into the LA lifestyle. And I think a lot of that in hindsight is because being in San Diego, the weather is exactly the same, but the culture is completely different.
I'd have to agree on that. I lived in LA for school, and I hated LA.
Did you go to audio school there? Is that what you did?
Yeah, I went to be a guitar player. I went out to be a guitar player and ended up finishing as an audio engineer.
Comes in handy now, right?
Yeah, because
look at all this cool shit you set up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, you have all these guitars on your wall.
Mm-hmm.
Were you ever a musician, or are you a musician?
No. I tried playing guitar when I was a kid. I just don't have... my theory on musicians is either you have it or you don't.
Yeah.
And there's no in between. You can take lessons till you're blue in the face, but if you don't viscerally feel music or see music, you hear a lot of true musicians talk about, and producers talk about this too, where they actually can see music, right?
Yeah.
It's a visual thing for them. And unless you have, not maybe that level, but if you can't like just kind of pick something up and go, you know what, I'm going to learn how to play piano, and you base it on your knowledge of guitar or vice versa, and you kind of can pick it up and more than get by, actually be pretty proficient. Someone like Dave Grohl, I would consider a true musician.
Yeah. I would have to say there's very few of those these days.
There are, and I don't disagree with that. But when they do come along, it's like it's pretty incredible to see someone who can like pick shit up and just play.
I feel like it's undeniable too. I feel like those artists just immediately go huge. I don't know. I feel like
yes and no. I mean, I've worked with artists who have that ability, and they haven't made it. Sometimes knowing everything there's to know about music, being able to feel and see music, sometimes is a disadvantage because maybe you're overthinking things. I don't know.
Yeah, I went to school with a lot of extremely talented people like you're talking about. And I would say, I don't know, there's a balance there you have to have, especially nowadays, being a musician and juggling the business and being okay with that.
Right.
Because when I lived in LA, I got super depressed because I learned about the music business. And
it's depressing.
It's super depressing. And so the reason I ended up actually being in audio and like going into audio is because I was doing guitar. And when I started, I loved guitar. And then it was kind of putting guitar in a box and kind of taking the creative out of it.
Right. Very technical. And
yeah.
Right.
And so, and my roommate was in the music business program at my school. So he would come home, we'd come home and chat, and he would tell me about the music business. And I would talk about like scales.
Right.
And
total disconnect,
yeah.
Right?
And it was super depressing learning about what he was learning about. So I chose to do the audio engineering thing. And then actually when I moved back to Colorado, I was completely going to give up music. And I don't know, I just went through a phase and just realized like I kind of accepted the music business for what it is.
Right.
And then I don't know, you kind of have to have like a blind hope, I feel like now these days, to just know what's going on and what music is and just kind of take the leap and do it.
Yeah, I think it is interesting how many people on the business side of music really fit that stereotype of when most people think of someone that's in the music business. And when you get to New York, you really, really see and feel that from a lot of people. And LA to a certain extent as well, where people are just very driven by material, driven by excess. They're attracted to the industry because they love being around musicians. They love the life, the nightlife, the glamour and all that. And I've never been part of that. I've been part of it, but I've never like bought into it. Like it's never been my thing. I've always been like, I don't want to be front and center. I like being behind the scenes. That's why you won't see me on like, I'm not, that's not my thing. And most people I know aren't, that's not really their thing either. And the people that it does become their thing, they're usually, run out at some point.
Yeah.
Some keep getting promoted at certain labels. It just seems to be, they want that type of person there. But the places I've worked at, I've always worked for like amazing people and really cool labels that are have almost always been primarily driven by the music. Okay. Like Roadrunner, when I started, Rhino New Artist was about that. Like Rhino was this incredible record company owned by two guys, Harold and Richard, that started selling records out of their trunk at the Pasadena swap meet on weekends. And then it just got to be really big, so they opened up a record store. And then that record store became really big, the one on Westwood near UCLA. It probably wasn't there when you were going to LA, when you were in LA, because I think it closed in the mid-2000s.
I don't think it was.
Incredible record store. It was like High Fidelity, if you've ever seen that movie with John Cusack. Yeah. That was like the record store, except for it had, instead of just 3 dirtbag employees, it had like 15 employees that knew a ton of music. Working at Rhino and then working at the record store, I learned so much about music. You think you know a lot about music, and then you work at a store like that, and you're working with people who are like amazing jazz buyers. They had their own individual jazz buyer, their own international music buyer, their own rock buyer. It was amazing. And it didn't specialize in anything popular. It was all like what was on the radio was not being sold at that store. It was really cool, eclectic shit. And it was just a really fun place to work. And like half the people I worked with were musicians. A couple of them were DJs. One guy was a jazz disc jockey who'd been on KPCC in LA for doing a show in LA, super respected jazz guy. And he was the buyer at Rhino. He was like this just bitter old man, but he fucking knew everything about jazz. And I, like I said, I walked in there thinking I knew about music and artists and albums and releases and shit, like, I don't know fucking shit. And then I didn't know anything. You realize it once you start working with people who really know.
Yeah. So you're getting your education in music through the record store.
Yeah, and then working at the label because, like I said, so Richard and Harold started the store, and then they wanted to get people into their store, which was already successful. So they reached out to this guy named, not Caveman Cole, what was his name? He was like this guy who wound up in an insane asylum, but he wrote this song called Come to the Rhino Store, and they released it on 45. They printed it up, pressed it on a 45, and sent it to the local radio stations in L.A., and all these stations just started playing it because they thought it was funny. It's just this dumb little, jingle called Come to the Rhino Store, and it's like 2.5 minutes long. It was just this dumb fucking song, but it sold a ton of copies, and it drove a bunch of people to their store. So like, well, we can put out records. And they were frustrated because there were certain artists that they couldn't find anymore. And so they went to the labels, and the labels at that time in the 80s didn't care about reissues at all. They put a record out, it would come and go, put the next record out, it would come and go. The idea, the notion of putting out a record from the 60s that was like a mid-charting record that most people don't give a fuck about does not cross any label's mind at that point at all. And so they just went to the labels and said, can we license record X? Can we license record Y? And labels are like, wait, you want to give us some money to like, you want to give us like 50 grand or not even, it wasn't 50 grand. There's no fucking way they paid for that. Maybe it was like 10 grand. You want to give us 10 grand to reissue this record? Sure. Go ahead. Here's the artwork. Here's the masters. They hired this guy named Bill Inglot, who was an amazing engineer, and he would take the original masters and redo them and update the sound. And Rhino was also really good with liner notes, so they would hire, incredible writers from Rolling Stone and Billboard and whoever. Sometimes they'd actually have the actual artist who produced the record, wrote the record, produced it, come in and write the liner notes for their own album that they'd put out maybe 20 years before. So it was very about the music. And as a result, that label was incredibly successful. That label, when Warner took them over, they were hands down the highest grossing record company in the Warner Music umbrella because Rhino had no overhead. There was no artists on the label that were sucking up tour support, spending $1 million in the studio. We weren't doing $1 million videos for anyone. There was just no overhead. It was just reissues. And so if we sold like 7,500 copies of something, it was pure profit after that, right? So our P&L sheets were just like outrageous because we'd reissue or put a compilation together and it would sell 50,000 copies and the break even was 5,000 copies or 7,000 copies or maybe 10,000 copies. We did this deal with Atlantic Records. Ahmet Ergen, who's like one of the most famous record company guys, record music guys ever. He founded Atlantic Records. He literally reached out to the Rhino guys and said, I want you to reissue my entire catalog. Here are the keys to the vault. There's only three artists you can't reissue. One of them was Led Zeppelin. And the first thing that they put out was an Aretha Franklin 4-CD box set that the break even on that was 9,500 units and sold 55,000 copies. Wow. It's probably gone on to sell 150,000 copies by now, but it was this beautiful work of art, and it kind of like harkened back to the days of LP cover art, with liner notes and all these cool things, but it was CD only. And, but it had like a 30-page book with these amazing photos, a foreword from Aretha Franklin herself talking about it. And she helped work on the 4 CDs on how she wanted it laid out and what songs she wanted. And Rhino was really great about trying to get the artists themselves to be involved in their compilation so they can not only give it credibility, but make sure they don't miss anything that maybe an artist wanted in their compilations.
Yeah. Is Rhino still around right now?
Yeah. Rhino's still around, but it's the owner is sold out years and years and years ago, but it's still part of Warner Music Group actually.
Yeah.
But I think that kids with streaming, they don't really, first off, people aren't buying records anymore at all. And kids, like my son Jack sitting there is 20, they don't, they won't go into Spotify and be like, what's a classic artist? The Rolling Stones. I'm going to go back and listen to the Rolling Stones. I've never listened to Rolling Stones record. Like, I've heard their songs on the radio, but I've never actually listened to a Stones album.
Yeah.
I've never listened to Exile Main Street or whatever. Tom Waits or the Eagles or whatever. They just don't care. There's no sense of history when it comes to music. My whole upbringing with music was based on history.
Yeah.
And a lot of us found music through what our parents were listening to, right? So you go back in time almost. And I just don't think that happens anymore, because I just don't think that a lot of kids have a sense of history. If I run into a kid who knows an older artist, there was a cashier yesterday, as a matter of fact, and this guy in front of me lays out, like, she says something, and then he says something based on an actual direct quote from a Beatles song. And she goes, I don't know what you're talking about. He goes, it's the Beatles. It was Revolution, actually. It was a song. And she said something, and he goes, yeah, talking about Revolution. And she's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, it's a Beatles song. She's like, yeah, my dad had some Beatles records, but I've never listened to them.
God.
And he looks at me, and I look at him, and I look at her, and I'm like, but it's typical, right? You can't, for some reason, and I think because nowadays there's so much music to consume.
I mean, not just music either. There's just so much to consume.
Good point. Everything.
Yeah.
Right? There are movies, there are television, but there's a lot of kids don't even watch television anymore. They just literally, what's on their phone is what they watch. And they'll get addicted to a show or a YouTube channel or something like that. Watch that over and over again. And then they'll move on to the next thing. So music consumption has changed, because when I was a kid, you would save your money, you would buy an album, and you would listen to that album forever. And then maybe in 4 weeks, you would go down and buy another record.
Yeah.
And when a release came out on Tuesdays, it was like a big deal to get record X or record Y from your favorite artist again. And most of the time you're disappointed as all get out, because you bought one record that you loved and then the next record was total shit. But whatever, you still listen to it 1,000 times over.
So you kind of got to sit with it. And I mean, I feel like, Jack, are you a millennial?
Yes, he is.
He is. So I'm a millennial too.
Jack swears he's on the tail end of being a millennial. He's a cusp.
You're Generation X?
That's a new one, all right. I think he made it up.
So you are a millennial, or you're not? I'm not. You're not a millennial.
Dad's calling bullshit on that because he acts like a millennial. But
so I guess I'm a millennial then. But I saw the transition from record, like physical CDs, to where we are now. So I feel like I kind of had that same, you bought a record and you got to sit with it and like get to know it and really, I don't know. I kind of miss that, where you spent time with something. But I also enjoy, like, when the Beatles came out on Spotify with all of their stuff, I've only heard the hits. I've never listened to a Beatles record, and I kind of didn't like the Beatles because of that, because it was just like forced down my throat. So then I went back when it came out and I listened to all of the Beatles records in order, and I was like, I finally get it. Right.
Pretty incredible, right?
Yeah.
Like those fuckers wrote just hit after hit after hit after hit. Yeah. And it's like, and not only, but they didn't rest on like Hard Day's Night and like, we're just going to keep making that record over and over and over again. They kept pushing the boundaries on everything they did. And they heard Pet Sounds from the Beach Boys, and they were like, oh my God, that song. Have you ever listened to that record, by the way?
Pet Sounds?
Yeah.
No, but I heard it influenced Sgt. Pepper.
Sgt. Pepper's, right. Yeah. So the Beatles were all wherever they were, but apparently they were together when Pet Sounds came out, and they listened to it all at the same time, and they're like, holy fuck, like we're not making, I think they just made the White Album, as a matter of fact, which is still an acclaimed and incredible record, but they're like, we can't do that again. We have to go next level, and they did Sgt. Pepper's, which is considered one of the most iconic rock records ever made, right?
But so is Pet Sounds. Paul McCartney cried when he heard Pet Sounds.
He may have, yeah. I mean, it's an incredible record. It really, and you have to think, when you listen to the Beatles and you listen to the Beach Boys, or you listen to anything from you listen to a Queen record or an Elton John record or an Eagles record, you don't have all the studio bells and whistles back then that you have now. You know, these guys were doing shit on one take, and they were editing on a 4-track or an 8-track, and they didn't have unlimited tracks that they could just like pop in samples or anything. None of that existed.
It all fell on the song. And
right, exactly. It fell
production.
On the musicianship, the writing, the vocals, the harmonies, the melody. Those things are what mattered in music, and you didn't have the luxury of falling back on technology. Yeah. And so when you listen to like a Queen record, if you go back and listen to a Queen record right now, and knowing that record was made like in the mid-'70s, knowing the technology they had in the 70s versus what we have now, which anyone can go out and buy a MacBook Pro and get Pro Tools on there or whatever and just crush it. Listening to what those guys did was incredible. I mean, absolutely
amazing.
Incredible. Yeah, amazing.
I had to chop up Bohemian Rhapsody for a recording class. We had to like take the 24 tracks, chop it up, and put it in Pro Tools. And you hear all of Freddie Mercury singing and then all of his harmonies. And
like cold, you would hear Freddie singing cold, just like
just cold. And you could even hear like the headphones from, you could hear the bleed from the headphones and the mic. And it's pretty amazing, like the notes that he can hit without autotune. And it's just like, it's autotune.
If you had told Freddie Mercury in like the mid 70s that you would have a thing called autotune when he got older, that he'd be able to like level his voice out, like, what are you talking about?
He'd be blown away. Adele uses autotune.
Does she?
Yeah. Actually, using autotune, there's like a glaze. I was just talking to my friend about this. There's a glaze that it puts on your vocal, and like you kind of have to put it on your vocal now. You don't have to, but it's just like I think people are so used to the sound of it.
I think
even if you can hit your notes.
Right. I think it's a safety thing, right?
Well, it's a safety thing, but I'll have to do this for you, but you like A/B it, and it's like literally like a glaze that it puts on. It makes it sound like warmer. It's weird.
Sure. I mean, that's what it's for, right?
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, we're talking about records that were like, if you go back to the history, you listen to like an Otis Redding song. Yeah. Right. And the emotion in his voice. And I mean, he was only famous for about 2.5 years, and then he died.
That's crazy.
Jimi Hendrix.
Yeah.
Only put it
my age.
The Beatles stopped touring. The Beatles only toured from 64 to 67.
See, I didn't know that. And then I looked at their like discography, and they just stopped touring and they just made albums and then stopped, right?
Yeah, and back then in the 60s, an artist, I think, was required to basically put out a record a year, essentially, if not more. But like Hendrix, The Doors, all those bands were really only around for a couple of years. Like the Doors were only really around from like 68 to 71 or so, and then Morrison died. And that's it. And you look back and go, wow, 3 years. But you think about how important and how influential like a Janis Joplin was, right? But she was only around for a fucking nanosecond. The Beatles were really only around for less than 10 years.
Yeah. Same with Jimi Hendrix and
I mean, AMZY's been a band now for how long?
Less than like almost 3 years now.
Right. So it's a third of the way to the Beatles.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Right. That's crazy.
Do you think that's a baby boomer thing? Like, do you think those bands are so huge, like Led Zeppelin, all those, because the baby boomers don't want to let go? Like they just they bought it on vinyl, then they bought it on
CD, and they've heard it on the radio. Cassette. I think there's something to that, but I guarantee you there are a lot of kids that know Led Zeppelin. Led Zeppelin was past my time. I know Led Zeppelin, and I still run into kids that still listen to Zeppelin.
Yeah. I got a Led Zeppelin story for you. So my girlfriend's sister, who's her fraternal twin, she always rocks band T-shirts, and it's always like Led Zeppelin or Nirvana or a Slayer or something, because
they look cool.
It's because what Urban Outfitters is selling right now.
Right.
So I'm like, this happened just the other day. We were walking into Guitar Center, and I was like, hey, before we go into Guitar Center, do you even know anybody's name in Led Zeppelin? And she's like, yeah. And I was like, name the singer. She's like, I was like, name the guitar player. That one's easy. Right. She's like,
right.
And I'm just constantly just like, it's trendy, I feel like, to know these bands, or like to wear these bands at least.
But it's like,
but not to actually know them.
Right. But that's that trend. I do find it funny when I see a kid wearing a Nirvana shirt, and you're like, there's no fucking way you know anything about Nirvana. You might, because that band was so iconic. Going back to iconic and timelines, Nirvana put out 3 records.
Yeah.
That's it.
Do you think with how just how people consume music in general now, there'll be a Beatles, Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, a Nirvana type band? Yeah,
I mean,
as
I
sad
don't
as that
want to
sounds-
sound like an old man and say, "Oh no, well, the music in my time was the best," because people will always go to that window of their primary listening years of music and go, "Oh no, my music,
Yeah.
was the best." When my window opened up, it then closed when I turned fucking 22, right?
Yeah.
And we all know that's not true, but I don't think that kids have this. I mean, it's just a fact that kids do not have the same visceral loyalty to an artist that they once had.
And that, you think that's from spending time with a record and just staring at that album cover for hours?
1,000 times over, and seeing these iconic bands come through town live. You have to realize that when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, there was no internet, right? So you didn't know every little juicy detail about your artist. If you were an alternative guy, you read Melody Maker or AP, right? If you were a rock dude, you read Circus magazine, which I read when I was a kid. The funny thing about Circus is if I went back and looked at like a Circus magazine from like 1981 or 82, it'd be fucking laughable, right? These cheese dick dudes dressed in like women essentially and singing these horrible hair band songs. You'd be like, what? And then it got even worse in the mid 80s, right? But these guys were icons. They were something to be worshipped. Nowadays, there's so much exposure with the internet and TMZ and Facebook and Instagram that it's hard to be mysterious.
Yeah.
There's no air of this guy is on this castle high and I'm down here in the village. Now it's kind of a level playing field. Guys are, kids want to emulate some of these musicians, if you want to call them musicians, DJs, singer-songwriters, whatever. But it's at a much more level playing field. Like they don't see it as so intangible as I would have seen it. Like if I was looking at Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden, who's an incredible vocalist, and those records were pre-hair band, but they were, if you listen to the first 4 or 5 Iron Maiden records, those are incredible records, absolutely just mind-blowing records. The early AC/DC records, like Back in Black, if you listen to Back in Black, and like that record, I mean, to be able to write, and this is where nowadays a record like that comes out maybe once every 5 years. When you listen to an AC/DC Back in Black, I was listening to that record when it first came out. I think it came out in 1980. If I put that record on today, it still sounds incredible. There's no part in that record where you're like, ugh, this sounds dated and old. It still sounds fucking amazing. Everything about that record sounds incredible. And you listen to it and you go, how did they do that? And then, like, going back to The Clash, which was one of my favorite bands, you listen to Clash records, and like they were so different and so creative. Zeppelin were always, like I was talking about, the Beatles, their early days when they were always pushing to the next level. They weren't complacent at all. They didn't want to be like this bubblegum boy band. Essentially, they were like they were maybe the very first boy band, other than some of the, I guess maybe not. There were some of those like doo-wop bands, but
yeah,
on the rock side, they were like the first boy band. They didn't sit on that and keep being the same thing. And if you look at The Clash, they were the same thing. They were started off as like a straight up punk rock band and then just started doing cool reggae shit, cool rock shit. Zeppelin was the exact same way. Zeppelin's first record is a straight up blues record. And then as they progressed into songs like Kashmir, you're like, how do you even come up with like a song like Dire Maker or Kashmir? How does that even like, it doesn't compute with me. Like I can't comprehend how 4 guys could be sitting in a studio going, okay, this is how we're going to fucking do this. It doesn't register with me. And I think nowadays, with a lot of, especially on the pop side, like with an Adele or a Beyonce or someone of that caliber, any of the pop acts, they're surrounded by endless streams of producers and engineers and musicians who just come in and knock this piece out. They come in and they sing their part, and then that's it. And then these producers create this amazing magic. That's what I find funny about rappers.
Well, I mean, the producers now are the real rock stars.
That's right, but they're still not given. I mean, now you're starting to see that credit being given. But that's a fairly recent development where producers are collaborating with vocalists and the producers are kind of turning out to be the stars. And Mark Ronson, obviously, you know, with Uptown Funk, which I still can't comprehend how he's given all the credit for that song when it's straight up Bruno Mars. Everything about that's Bruno, right?
Yeah.
But like, you know, DJ Khaled and, you know, everyone he collaborates now with is all a superstar. Chainsmokers.
I feel like, I mean, just my knowledge of music history, I feel like it's like the early 50s where there was like mega producers
I'll agree with that.
putting bands together, putting out singles. Because I feel like nowadays everything's a singles market, right?
Extremely singles driven. Album, the album is essentially dead. That's why I'm a big advocate of the EP, because from a music consumer standpoint, like we could go up and pull up Spotify and look at the Portugal the Band album, right?
Yeah.
People will look at the single and it'll be at like millions. You know, that single's probably at 100 million streams on Spotify. But then you look at the rest of the record and there's probably songs on there that probably have less than 20,000 streams because kids just do not consume music in that way anymore. It's very singles driven, extremely singles driven. So I don't know why an artist would spend so much time in the studio doing a full work, as an album used to be called like a full body of work, and just to have it not be listened to.
There's pros and cons to both, sides there, because you were talking about Back in Black, that album and albums like that, and I feel like the reason those albums are so good is because the time that was put into them.
Sure.
They could sit with those and work on it. And nowadays it's just like turn and burn.
Yes.
But there's also a plus to the turn and burn and the streaming, I would say, because you can I feel like you can grow more as an artist because you can just keep,
right.
Like, really, I don't know how the music business is going to go, but I feel like it's going to turn into a thing where it's like an artist is expected to put out an album every 3 to 6 months. Not an album, but like
EP
a single
or a song.
or an EP.
Yeah.
And so that's just going to allow you to grow as an artist and really, just hone who you are. And before it was like you, I feel like in the 90s, I don't really know, but I feel like it was like this. You made an album and you sat on it till it was the right time to put out.
Sure. And you wouldn't put an album out but for every 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And I agree with you with the way that the music industry is set up now with technology, being able to go in and knock a song out in a few days. That allows you to stay fresh. It allows you to stay creative. It allows you to try, and with studio time being so cheap as well, it allows you to go in and knock something out that you want to try. And maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. And if it does work, well, we're not going to fucking wait for us as a band to write 11 more songs.
Yeah.
Let's just put this out. We put out the first single off of the Panic at the Disco record in April, this last Panic record, in April, and we didn't put the record out until February. So the song was there, and then we literally put out 2 or 3 songs before the album even came out. Back in the day, that was unheard of. You would put a single out 6 to 8 weeks before the album dropped. It was like this whole methodology, right? And back then, let's just say back then, meaning in the 90s, when I was at RCA, we would put out a record. We would get it built up on radio for 8 weeks, try to get as much product out as possible, shipping product, obviously, because there was no digital or online anything. And you would get your big bag first week and then try to keep the thing going. And then you would put out 1 or 2 or 3 singles, and then the artist would keep touring for a little while. They go back in the studio and then do it all over again. And you would, do these long setups. You would do these like 90-day to 6-month long setups in advance for press because, press had to have it. And then that means you had to do artwork with like full artist color your graphics guys would have to do full color separations, and you couldn't just mock something up on the fly like you can now. These were like crazy processes. Whereas now, as an artist like AMZY, you guys, I know you're working on some new music. You guys could literally be like, well, we're not going to wait until we have 2 songs we really love. Let's put them out. Yeah. We don't need to wait until we get 4 songs. We don't need to wait till we have 8 more songs. We can just put them out now. And I think that's the beauty of music in this day and age. And like you said, it's a good and bad thing.
Do you feel like, I don't know, I feel like it's kind of full circle or kind of history repeating itself of like the 50s of
Singles
driven. You just go and record a single, put it out, go and record a single, put it out.
Yeah, correct. It's ironic that happened because the band that started the album as a full body of work was the Beatles.
Yeah.
So prior to the Beatles, it was all just Elvis would go in, knock out a song, and then it would go to radio, and then he would just keep knocking out songs. He was very singles driven, and all those guys were, all those early 50s artists, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, all those cats. All those groundbreaking, musicians from that time, they weren't putting out full ensembles of work on one piece of vinyl. But when the Beatles came out, their records were so amazing that it really drove musicians to want to do full bodies of work.
Yeah.
And then as we got into the 80s, everything became so industrialized in that, artists were under pressure to put out big radio singles. And they would put a record together and have 3 great radio songs, and then everything else would suck, right? And you were kind of in that grind for a while. On alternative, those records were more full bodies of work, but they weren't exposed as much. On the rock side, like hair band side, you'd have 3 or 4 good songs, and the rest was shit. But no one cared because you were forced to buy a full record.
Yeah. I always think of the 80s as kind of current now. I feel like hair metal in particular and dance music and kind of newer rap is all tied together because it's about partying and just having a good time. And I feel like a lot of dance music, like huge dance music, mainstream dance music is like that. And also new hip-hop coming out. Because old hip-hop used to be, like early 90s, I feel was like more storytelling of like real...
survival. It was about like, this is what it's... And then they will all tell you that. You listen to Ice-T, Ice Cube, Dre, any of those cats. They will all say that, these were written about, life experiences. This is what it's like. And yeah, it's ugly, it's dirty, it's fucking hella dark. But this is what we live with in Compton. This is what we live with in Queens. This is... our life in, Cabrini Green in Chicago, whatever. And yeah, now it's kind of gotten back to more party atmosphere.
Yeah. But I mean, there's always exceptions, obviously. But yeah, I definitely think I always think of that like hair metal and I compare it to where we are now. And it's,
have you seen the Defiant ones yet?
Yeah. I watched it the first day I came.
Amazing.
I watched all of it. Loved it.
Yeah. And that documentary is, in my opinion, the best music documentary ever made because it really opens the, especially on the music business side, it really talks about what everyone was going through and those scenes where Jimmy Iovine's on the West Coast and he's dealing with like all these assholes at Warner Corporate and Sony Corporate and who were terrified because shareholders and all this bullshit that shouldn't be involved in music were really getting in the way and hamstringing what kids really wanted.
Yeah.
But they were afraid of upsetting their corporate and politicians and all that. And I was there for all of that. And you kind of like, as you're in our industry, you're like, what's the big deal about? Ice-T wrote this song called Cop Killer when I was living in LA. And it was like a big fucking deal. Right. And it was a big deal when that came out. And because there was so much animosity between, and so you're going back to like what, you're talking about like music that actually resonates on a bigger level than just a song. When you were able to write a song like a Buffalo Springfield song about politics and what's really going on in the world today, and you're able to write a song that connects at that level with people, then you kind of have a classic.
Yeah, timeless song.
Timeless. It's hard to do. It's about timing and luck, but I think that you still see that nowadays. But I agree with you. It seems like music, especially on the pop side, it's shallow.
how I don't think there is going to be another Nirvana or a Beatles, because
There could be. You never know.
I think it's just a pattern repeating itself. You know, I think people want shallow sometimes, and then they get sick of that. And like with hair metal, they always say Nirvana was the nail in the coffin of hair metal, right?
They do, and that's true to a certain extent. But if you really, the history is actually a little more expansive than that. In that, when Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction came out, that was really the first nail in hair metal's coffin, right? Because when that record came out, have you ever listened to that record?
I have.
Right. So when you listen to that record, and once again, you have to put it in the context of when it was made in 1986 and came out in 87. Everything was like big hair, fucking bands like Great White and Cinderella and Motley Crue had gone from being this like cool, edgy, really edgy band. Motley Crue's first 2 records were really edgy and really great, really street sounding. To then they became
so hard to think of now.
I know, it's sort of thing because they do fucking crap records like Girls Go Girls and shit like that. And at that time, those were the monster records. And all of a sudden, Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction comes out. And it almost tanked. I mean, Geffen didn't know what to do with it when they put it out. Radio didn't want to touch it. MTV was the ones who said, we're going to play this video. And they had no reason to play that video other than they felt the song was great. And then that blew that record way up. And that was kind of the beginning. And then, yeah, physically within months of Nirvana's Nevermind coming out, all labels stopped signing hair bands. They literally were persona non grata. Like it was that black and white.
It was a dead stop.
It was a dead stop. And you had bands that were really on a tear. But then you still had, at that time, you had underground metal bands. Like Metallica was still underground for the most part. Pantera, Megadeth, Anthrax. Those bands had mad credibility with hardcore.
They kind of weren't even in the same, like, realm as hair metal. I mean, they were there, but they were totally different in terms of songwriting and like.
Well, they had credibility, whereas hair metal bands didn't. Hair metal bands had sales, they had popularity, they had radio, but bands like Iron Maiden on the earlier days of metal, of the 80s and late 70s, they had mad credibility, which then carried into bands like Metallica and Megadeth and Anthrax and Pantera, and those bands all survived.
They were like that
grunge
that
days.
gritty metal.
Oh, yeah. I mean, they were street.
Yeah.
You know, they were legit. Radio wouldn't touch those bands. And because radio wouldn't touch those bands, they didn't have the popularity. They weren't selling the records. But they still did incredibly well touring-wise because they had credibility.
Yeah. Well, that kind of brings me to a later question. But where do you think, where do you see the industry going in 20 years with streaming and where it is now?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't think anyone can answer that because I think that people are always going to be driven to put out music. It's getting as easy as it is now in 2017. Think about how easy it's going to be in 2027 or 2037.
Yeah.
2037 is what you're asking. I don't even know what it's going to be like because when I was a kid, there was no technology, right? I mean, when I first got into radio, I was writing copy on an IBM Select typewriter with fucking paper, and you roll it in and you change the ribbon and hoped it worked. And you hope you didn't make a typo because it was a bitch to go back. There were no cell phones, there was no internet. There was none of that. And you just see, just in the advent of the last 10 years of the smartphone, we're at the anniversary of the smartphone, right? 10-year anniversary of the iPhone that came out. You think about how your life has changed in 10 years because of that phone and how often you're looking at your phone and how often you're depending on that phone, which is crazy. But I honestly can't look ahead. Anyone who thinks they can look ahead 20 years and know what it's going to be like is out of their minds. I have fucking no idea what it's going to be like.
Is that from being in the industry so long and seeing it change so dramatically?
I think so, maybe. But I think also being a guy who really appreciates and understands history and trying to predict what the future is going to be, knowing as much about history as I do, I still would. The only thing I can say about the future is I have no idea.
So there's a lot of, I know Spotify just hired one of like the biggest AI music makers out there, do you think people are going to start listening to artificial music, meaning made by robots?
I don't think so. I want to believe, and I could be wrong, but I want to believe that the beauty of people who appreciate music is a lot of it has to do with their envy of musicians, right?
Yeah.
So when you're an audience member, you really are enjoying the music, but you also, a big part of you wants to be on that stage, right? You see those guys on stage, and you want to be that guy, even if it's just for an hour while that guy or that band is up there. You can't help but be envious of what they're doing, right? They're up there creating music, but they're also having 18,000 fans screaming and this adoration and this love that pours on them. There's a reciprocating effect from that, right? As a musician, you love that adoration. As a consumer, you love to give the adoration. And I just can't see, some robot that has Honda across his chest, like playing a fucking keyboard or hitting play on a MacBook Pro, and that having that same adoration. Now, that being said, I think it's, the EDM thing is kind of silly in a lot of ways. With a lot of those EDM musicians just putting beats behind it and then walking up, literally pushing play on a MacBook Pro and just standing there waving their hand in the air with a killer light set up behind them. So I would have never predicted that would have been big.
Yeah.
I would have thought for sure you would have to actually have a guitar in your hand or be able to sit down and play piano. So I was wrong on that front. And, so who knows? I mean, I really, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I'd have to agree. I think the live thing is what's going to keep music going.
Absolutely. And I think live music is what saved our industry, because when records failed starting in 2000 and CD sales just tanked because of online abilities to just steal music essentially. And before streaming really started to pop just a few years ago, we were in really dire straits. I mean, labels went, just in Denver alone, when I first moved here in August 1st, 1993, there were like 23 different record companies represented here in Denver alone.
Wow, that's crazy.
And now there's two, me and a guy named Tim Dahlback, and we actually work for the same company, and we're both nationals for the same. He works on the Atlantic side, I work on the Roadrunner side, but we're all in the same umbrella. And we kind of laugh about it because when I first moved here, there were endless record companies. And because of this massive decline starting in 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, you just saw this group of people, great people, just get whittled down to two people. Radio's the same thing. Radio used to have, when I first got into radio at 91X, we had, not even counting the sales side, we had about 25 employees between DJs, copywriters, programmers, promotion team, production team, doing all sorts of stuff. Like KTCL, I think they have like 4 full-time employees.
That's crazy.
Like, that's it. Literally, it's Nerf, Steve, Bailey, Smitty.
That's it?
That might be it.
Wow.
There might be 1 or 2 more. But that's
insane.
it. Nick Cage is like part-time. He splits between digital and his 1-hour shift in the middle of the days, and then he does fill in. And B Large is there, but he's not full-time. Alpha is there, but he's not full-time. I mean, so, it's wild to think that. But that's kind of the change that has taken place in 30 years.
Yeah. Do you think radio is going to be around in another 20 years?
Really good question. Radio is still the primary driver for sales in the United States, right? So radio is still responsible for 90% of the sales that happen in the United States and consumption that happens in the United States, whether it's streaming or sales. I think that you're going to start to see that continue to trend down as radio continues to be less relevant. We are spoiled in Denver by having KTCL and KBCO and even like the Mountain. These stations are really pro music lover, right?
Yeah.
And they're really communal. They're very, very, this is the word I'm looking for. They're very communal. Like when you're listening to KTCL, you feel like they're part of Denver, and they make you feel like you're part of Denver when you're listening, right? Because you pick up things like shows and concert calendars and
Yeah.
Just random shit, right? That you don't get if you're just listening to music.
Well, and they care about the local scene as well.
Absolutely. Well, they're very unique in that sense. But I think that where corporate radio has really failed themselves in a huge way, starting in deregulation, there's a huge deregulation thing that happened in 95, 96. And when they deregulated radio, it allowed giant corporations to come in and kind of just, as corporations always do with the mom and pop, they will suck the fucking soul out of it. That's exactly what happened with radio. So, everything was deregulated. They homogenized things. Jocks are being piped in. Like, I have friends who are DJs that are literally on 10 different radio stations around the country. But they might be based in San Antonio. They might be based in Denver. They might be based wherever. At one point, like, Uncle Nasty was like on 7 radio stations for iHeart.
I thought I heard him in other places.
Yeah, I mean, he was in San Jose. He was in Albuquerque. He was in El Paso. He was all over the place. And when you are a jock and you're just, hey, that was this is that, come up, be the ninth caller or whatever. And you just kind of lose that heart and soul, that community sense that DJs are supposed to bring to a radio station. When corporations came in and consultants came in the mid-90s.
So, real fast, they were kind of like the record store.
Absolutely. You would hear it on the radio, and then you go to the record store and buy it.
And you trusted who was on the radio.
Absolutely. That was it, exactly. When a DJ was talking about a record or spinning a record, even though the program director made sure that that record was where it was at that time, you're going to play this record at the top of the hour, then the next record is going to be this, whatever. So the program log that the DJ has to follow, there's still a certain amount of credibility when that DJ is talking about record X or record Y. And you were definitely driven to go out and buy it. I mean, that's how I bought most of my music.
Yeah. Well, they were tastemakers, right?
Exactly.
I have a theory. Spotify is big on playlists, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like Spotify is awesome because you can just search and find some random band, but you find a good playlist, you can just put that band in your lap. And now I feel like tastemakers are being transformed to Spotify, meaning like playlist makers are the new tastemakers.
Absolutely.
And I feel like labels are jumping on that.
100%.
Is that a thing?
100%. A great example is Little Uzi Vert, E.2 Tour Life, right? That song was not on the radio, but that song has been in the top 5 most streamed Spotify song in the world for the last, 10, 15, 20 weeks. And now radio is finally coming around to it. So what we're having is, whereas we, record company people, would be influencers on radio stations, and then they would put it on, and then those jocks would influence the consumer into buying that record, because that's what my job is. Now it is kind of flipped around, and you're having consumers of streaming actually influence programmers.
Yeah, I've noticed that with KTCL in particular. There's a playlist on Spotify, and if you listen to that playlist, I noticed it's a good month delay. The top songs in there will be then in either the music survey or start being played on 93.3.
Sure, right. And they may make it through, and that's absolutely true. And a lot of times we put out, when did we put that record out? The Kiara Gold record we put out last February. So it was February 2016, and the artist is named Kiara. Her single was called Gold. We didn't take that record to radio until it was at 80 million Spotify streams.
Holy crap.
80 million. And that's when we took it to Top 40 Radio. It's at 500 million now. It's at 500 million fucking streams, which is pretty incredible, right? It's a significant number of streams. But as Spotify grows in popularity, you're seeing that, like, when you get to 80 million, 100 million, 120 million, then it's like, okay, this might be real, but, if you have records that are sitting at like 20 million streams and you try to tell radio stations, you need to play this because it's 20 million streams, they're like, I'm not playing record X, Y, and Z, and all those are over 100 million streams.
Yeah.
So we actually are using streams to help influence programmers, and it'll make them aware. We're working a record called Clean Bandit. The song right now is called Symphony. And that record is at 313 million Spotify streams. That was last week. It's probably more now. And over 330 million YouTube streams. And we still are getting slack from radio stations like they just don't want to fucking play it, even though it's clearly a hit. And the prior single was called Rockabye from that band, and that was a top 5 pop song. And we still have pop programmers going, I don't know. 300 million streams, and they're still like, I don't know.
It's crazy.
It's crazy. Despacito is like, I've got a programmer who still won't play Despacito. He's like, I think
Really?
the only guy in the country not playing that record.
Is it just because he's just like, I'm not?
I don't
I'm
know.
not. I'm gonna be the last guy. I'm gonna hold on.
I think he's going to be the guy who just is proud to say he never played that record, which is crazy because that record's at 2.7 billion. Billion. Just on Spotify.
Holy shit! I didn't even billion
with a B. Like a billion served.
That's crazy.
It's crazy.
That's out of control.
Yeah,
so,
it's out of control.
Do you think your job's gonna switch to trying to go to Spotify and influence those people?
We already have like a whole digital group that's all they do now. So we used to have huge sales departments, right?
Yeah.
And those sales departments were in charge of hanging posters in stores, getting product in stores, talking to owners of record stores. And you got to realize also back in the 70s and 80s that there weren't a lot of like corporately owned record stores. The majority of record stores were still mom and pops. And then you would have like a Tower Records, right, which was like the big boy and
was the
on
Walmart
campus.
of record stores.
Walmart record stores. That's all they sold were records. And Tower probably had, I think they peaked out at 53 stores. And you think about that, like how many Target stores are, how many Walmart stores, how many Best Buys,
how many Starbucks,
how many fucking Starbucks there are, and you think about how things have changed, and there's this kind of it's a very fluid and dynamic industry, and just when you think, like a lot of industries now, and just when you think you have it figured out, bam, in 1999, Napster comes out, and all of a sudden you're like, what's this? And everyone I worked with in New York was like, it's nothing. Don't worry about it. We're not going to, it's not over. In 98, 97, I was in a meeting. I was doing artist development in New York. I was in a meeting, and our general manager, Jack Rovner, is a total cock. He was like, at the end of the meeting, we used to do these 8-hour-long marketing meetings every Wednesday. And there's like 25 of us in this room. And it's just like all like the product managers and the format heads and department heads and stuff, kind of the key people. And it's in these meetings, and we talk about records and break things down, what we're going to do, and blah, 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 where we're going to go, what's MTV doing this, blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the meeting, Jack goes, and this is in late 97, he goes, does anything else, anyone want to bring anything up? And I go, stupidly, yeah, I want to bring something up. What are we doing about these kids ripping music and stealing our music? And he's like, he looked at me like I had 3 fucking heads, and he's like, Jason, who cares? It's small. It doesn't matter. I'm like, Jack, it's going to matter. And he's like, and he just got up and walked away. He just thought it was fucking crazy. And I saw that, like, if this is starting on college campuses, it's just going to spread. And I had friends in Boulder that had hard drives just full of ripped music, 10, 15, 20,000 songs. And you think back then, that was an amazing amount of songs, because if you had a CD collection, you may have had 10,000 songs if you had a huge, significant collection.
Yeah.
Now, with streaming services, I don't understand. What blows me away is why people still buy music. Why? Yeah. Why buy a single? Why buy an album? Because it's at your fingertips for $10 a month. I don't get it. And so, to answer your question about the future is, who knows? I mean, honestly, I wish I had a crystal ball, because then I'd be investing in whatever's going to be hot for like 5 years. But you look at, like, if you go back in time, 10 years, MySpace was massive. Facebook comes out, everyone's like, oh, there's no fucking way MySpace is going away. Who's Facebook? Why would they even try this? This is what MySpace is doing. Why would I want to get on Facebook? And now Facebook stock's at $166 a fucking share, and MySpace is nowhere to be found. So you just go, wow.
Now it's like a streaming platform.
Exactly. I don't even know if it's around. Is it still around?
Yeah, it's still around.
Right.
Justin Timberlake bought it, I think.
Right. Well, he invested. He tried. Yeah, they're trying to revive it. But like SoundCloud is about to go out of business, and SoundCloud is
SoundCloud is about to go out of business.
They're going to go out of business. They just laid off like 30% of their staff. They're done. They won't make it. They may not make it to the end of the year.
That's not good news for this podcast.
Is this on SoundCloud?
Yeah, this is on SoundCloud.
Maybe we should put this on Apple. So I think that if you look at SoundCloud and how many people use SoundCloud, my son has been on SoundCloud for 5 years, 7 years. I mean, he was turning me on to SoundCloud. I didn't know what SoundCloud was until Jack was like, "Oh, Dad, you gotta check out SoundCloud." And so, pushing 50, it's hard for someone like me to see the future because I'm so rooted in the past, right? And it's really a unique situation. I think that was the most fascinating thing to me about the Defiant Ones is how Jimmy Iovine, who's certainly rooted in the past, worked on some of the most amazing, iconic records ever made, started his first engineering gig working with John Lennon, and his first producing, and then second engineering gig was Bruce Springsteen. How he is still looking ahead, forward. And I feel like I wish I'd seen that documentary when I was 20 years old. It would have changed my life, but I feel like those guys are, if I can do my best to alter my way of thinking into thinking like, okay, that was the past. Stop talking about the past. Stop dwelling on the past. And what is the future?
Yeah.
And it's interesting as Jack has gotten older. I look to him to like, okay, what's going on? And it weighs. I mean, he carries a lot of weight with me. His friends carry a lot of weight with me when they are talking about something. I'm not just dismissing it. I'm listening because I don't feel like I know what the future is anymore. I may have known it when I was 20, 25, 30.
I don't feel like I know what the future is.
Right. I don't think most people know because
you're 20 years old, Jack? I'm only 7 years older than you, and I feel like I have no idea what's going on anymore.
Jack may feel that way. I had Jack when I was your age.
That's crazy.
Right. It's kind of crazy. But I remember my mom when she was 21 and she was pregnant with my little sister. I was already 3 and my brother was already 5. So it's all about context. And my context of the industry is I've seen the good of my career in the industry is my 30-year anniversary is May 6, 2018. And so I can look back on those 30 years and go, wow, I mean, fuck, when I got into radio, we were still putting singles on a turntable and like putting the needle on and back cueing it. So when you hit it, you had to make sure you didn't get the lag in the turntable. And because even the best turntable still would have a little bit of lag. So you have to like spin it back a quarter turn or whatever the metric was you would use for that turntable. And now that looks arcane. I mean, that's like the fucking Stone Ages.
I can't even imagine that.
Right, but then you go 30 years from 1988. You go back 30 years. It's 1958, right? And like, what were they doing then? And it was just
just like live in studio.
Television was in its infancy back then, and so and now television is becoming irrelevant. In 30 years. There may not be an ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox. There just may not be those. And when I was a kid, all we had was ABC, CBS, and NBC. That was it. You didn't have DVDs, DVRs. We didn't have VHS. That came out in the early 80s. And you look back in those times and you think about like how big something like in the 80s and even in the 90s and even in the early 2000s, I guess, how big Blockbuster Video was, right? Yeah. Like that was the thing. Jack and I every Friday or Saturday or Friday and Saturday, we would walk down to the Blockbuster
do that same thing.
We had different Blockbusters over the time, but like the one that we would go to at one point, was the Blockbuster on Ogden and Colfax, right? And it's like a money lending place now or something shitty. And so we go there and
it's a weed store now.
Right, it's a weed store. We get a DVD and go home. And like my buddies in high school, we'd get VHSs and put it in. But like when I was a kid, that existed. You would stay home on a Saturday and watch The Bionic Man or watch, Dukes of Hazzard or Different Strokes or something. And that was like your whole life. And 30% of the country was watching that same show. And now, the entertainment, you were talking about this earlier, like in a way, but the entertainment pie is just sliced every year, is sliced thinner and thinner and thinner as music consumers or as youth, because youth they generate everything entertainment, right? Older people have their say in movies and music, whatever, but the real consumption of music has always been a youth-driven consumption, dating all the way back to Chuck Berry and Elvis Presley, and then you get onto the Beatles and the Stones and the Doors and the Who, and you get into the 70s. All of that is still driven. Everything was always driven by youth all the time and still is driven by youth. Jack will play me hip hop shit, and I just want to fucking vomit because I think it's horrible. But then, like, you look it up, and it's got hundreds of thousands of streams, and it's like, it sounds like he stuck a dick in his mouth and got really high and tried to rap something. It's like, what is going on? And when I say stuff like that, I do feel old, right? Because obviously it is working, and I just don't connect with it. So I'm excited about the future. I feel like and as I've gotten recently, I've tried to not to look at the past as like the good old days, and I'm trying to look towards the future because, and I think a lot of this is because there is a brighter side now. Like we have, as a music business, we have transitioned from these really, the darkest days of the music industry were basically from 2005 until just like 2012, 2013, even from some labels 2014. And since really 2014, let's say, labels have a solid foundation now, and they're making going back up. They're bringing people back in. They're hiring people. If Jack had asked me if he wanted or told me he wanted to be in the music industry when he got older back in 2010, I would have said, fuck no, you're not going to do it. Now I'm like, you should do it because there is a significant future in working for a record company now.
So you think signing with a label is still a relevant thing?
Depends on the label. Depends on the music. But absolutely, generally, 100%, because it is like working with AMZY, as we've, as me and Ali going to the management side, me and Ali have we explained this to you guys. It's like you still, at the end of the day, AMZY has created this fire, right? The analogy I use often is like, you guys have built this fire. This beautiful Denver bonfire, right? It's great. You can go out, you can sell 600, 500 tickets on a moment's notice now, and that's fantastic. Local airplay, you're kind of local celebrities. Well, if we're able to get you on a record company, a real record company, a good record company, not a shitty record company, good record company, they come up with a giant can of gasoline and just throw it on your fire. And they turn this fire, this nice fire, into a big, giant, raging bonfire. And that's kind of, I think, a good analogy for what a label can do for you. You were really hamstrung without a record company. It's hard to get the Fallons of the world, the Saturday Night Lives of the world. It's hard to get, MTV News. It's hard to get any looks press-wise without being part of a bigger machine that can drive that home. Now, that being said, there are artists that have done an amazing job of their own. And, Jack laughs at me when I mention Skrillex because he's like yesterday's EDM artist, even though I have a hard time comprehending that, because he's generating like $40 million a year. But, for the most part, he's done it on his own, right? He is signed to Atlantic Records. He's on Big Beat, which is a sub-label of Atlantic. But he's really done it on his own. He's not looking to us. He puts his music out whenever he fucking wants to put his music out. He puts whatever he wants to put out. He doesn't consult with us to do that. And then you look at what's his name? Why am I drawing a blank?
Deadmau5?
Well, Deadmau5 is there, but like who's the Chance the Rapper?
Okay.
Is a great example right now. There's a guy who's doing it all on his own.
He's not on a label?
No.
Wow, that's crazy.
He does everything on his own. And he is now this like style icon. He's a music icon. He's a live performance icon. And he still has a head on his shoulders. He's a smart kid. But he is the exception, not the norm.
Yeah.
And like Mac Miller, do you know Mac Miller?
No, Macklemore.
No, but Macklemore is actually, that's a good example as well. So Macklemore, let's just take that. He put that record out, Thrift Shop, whatever it was called, and put it out on his own. And then ADA, which is a sub-label of Warner Music Group, they picked it up because he needed distribution, and that's all he really wanted. But that label is connected to Warner Music Group, and then Warner Brothers, which is in the Warner Music Group umbrella, is like, well, we're gonna put our can of gasoline on this fire. And then that blew him through the roof. But he couldn't have done that with Thrift Shop. As cool as that song was not going to be a number one pop song on its own. There's just no way it would have done that. Most programmers wouldn't, without the backing of a major record company, are not going to support an unsigned act. They just don't. But going back to what we were saying earlier, about an hour ago, is like when you look at Little Uzi Vert, his streaming numbers are so high that Rhythm Crossover had to play him. Now he's sitting at number 4 on the crossover chart, the rhythm chart. KS107, that type of format. He wouldn't have gotten there if it wasn't the fact that he is sitting at, he has massive streaming numbers.
Yeah. Is he on a label?
He's on Atlantic, yeah.
Was that before his numbers or after?
Yeah, it was. We signed him when he was like, a kid.
So there's still hope for people who don't have 500 million plays?
Yeah, exactly. There is.
Okay.
There is. But what's interesting about streaming is if you were like an alternative artist like AMZY is, if you're a rock artist, if you're a singer-songwriter, if you're a country artist, you're pretty much ostracized from the top of the streaming chart.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if you look at the top, I'll show you a chart that has like the top 200 most streamed songs last week. There's only maybe one or two alternative acts on there, like Imagine Dragons' Believer, which is a massive song, is sitting in like the 40s. And that is a massive song.
Why do you think that is?
Consumers. Kids like Jack. They don't care.
Rock and roll's not cool anymore?
No, they want EDM, they want rap, and like that's it.
Well, actually, I feel like rap is rock and roll now.
It is, yeah. It's a new rock and roll. It's a new frontier. And I think and to be honest, it really has been since it really kind of blew up in the mid 80s to early 90s. What's funny is, I remember being in high school and acts like Run DMC were starting to come out. Beastie Boys were coming out. And people were like, oh, this rap shit is just a fad. And then in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, like 89, 90, 91, you had gangster rap come out, like NWA. And they just like took it to a whole new level. Whereas people just thought it was just going to go away. The rap thing was like annoying. It's a nuisance.
Music.
It's a fad.
Or dubstep.
Dubstep, there you go.
Yeah.
It's going to go away. And it just hasn't. It just it's turned into this massive cultural influencer. And the reality of like Little Uzi it's not black kids and Hispanic kids, streaming Little Uzi Vert. It's the dopey middle class white kids like Jack streaming Little Uzi Vert. Those are the kids that are finding Little Uzi Vert because those are the kids that are paying for Spotify.
You just blew my mind right there.
Sorry.
All right, so this is my most important question. Any advice you would give young artists, young musicians, bands coming up in the music scene?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that some of the best advice I could give to a musician is be true to yourself. Don't follow trends. Don't look at what's on the radio. Don't listen to what's on the radio. Think that that's what you want to be. Don't look at artists who are like top streaming artists and be like, oh, I'm going to do that so I can be a top streaming artist. When you chase trends as a musician, first off, you're not true to yourself, and kids, consumers, know that right away. I think most music consumers get a sense of who's real and who's not, right? What's a trend? Well, you have like novelty songs that pop up all the time, like Despacito is going to be a novelty song. Those guys aren't going to go any further than that one track. And it was great while it lasted. But then you have other artists who are like true artists and always been true to themselves, are always breaking new barriers, trying new things, pushing themselves to the limit because they're not complacent. And they don't care about the money. Those are the guys that I've always looked up to. Those are the guys, that haven't sold out, in quotes. And I think if you're a true musician, like we were talking about earlier, someone who can just pick up an instrument and just feel music in their gut. You may not be able to read music, but you have this desire to just play chords and structure a song because you've written something that you want to attach that to. You've written a poem that you feel would be better with music, and so you're going to you may only know 3 chords. Neil Young knows 3 chords. Fucking guy's had an entire career since the mid-'60s on 3 chords. But he's always done it his way. And I've always been, kind of heartbroken by bands that kind of try to chase trends. And like the best example of that is the Cult wrote 2 incredible records. They wrote a record called Love, and they put it out in 1985. And then their follow-up was Electric. And both records are absolutely amazing. Electric came out in 87. And when you listen to those records, they are just pure, visceral gut from my fucking soul records, right? then their follow-up was like this shitty rock record. And I remember going to Tower Records. I worked at 91X. The record was coming out that day. I could have easily gotten a copy from 91X, but I wanted to buy it because I wanted to support the band. So I drove down to Tower Records by Sports Arena, right down the street from the radio station, and I bought that record. I put it in my bus that I had, my 7M VW bus, and I immediately was like, what the fuck is this? It was such a disappointment. But that record was their biggest, most commercially successful record. And I fucking hated it because I felt like they were chasing that. And yeah, they may have won, but they lost me and they lost other people because I feel like they sold out. And anyone who's like a true Cole fan hates that record.
Do you think that was on purpose, or that's how they grew as a band?
Not sure. It's hard to tell. But I feel like they were pushed in that direction because Love and Electric were successful in the sense that kids on the underground bought that record. But if they're not going to get to the next level if they wrote another Electric. They needed to write something that was more commercially viable. So my suspicion is that their label, their A&R guy, pushed them in that direction.
That makes sense.
And that happens, unfortunately.
It's sad.
But when you listen to like early Jane's Addiction records, early Smashing Pumpkins records, neither one of those guys can sing. They can't sing to save their fucking life. Perry Farrell he sounds like a cat in heat. He's awful. But those early records were so just, like I said earlier, like they're from the soul. And you listen to the lyrics on those records, like Nothing Shocking, and their first record, the Triple X record, which was a live record that they did. You know, you can't get enough of those records. And the first three Smashing Pumpkin records with Gish and Siamese Dream and Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, those records are just amazing bodies of work. But Billy Corgan has a horrible voice.
Yeah.
And when he started making crappy records, that was it. You can't tolerate his voice you can't listen to his voice in conjunction with a shitty song. It's impossible. But because Gish was such an incredible record, you looked past that. You looked at him as someone who was writing absolutely 100% believing what he was singing. And I think that's what's important as a musician, to like really kind of be true to yourself. And if you listen to like, Christina Perri record, like you listen to her first single, Jar of Hearts, when you hear that song, you feel every single pain in her bones when she wrote and sang that song. You know, it's about a breakup, right, or whatever. It's about a guy who has her number. And every time she would go back to Philadelphia from L.A., she was a waitress in L.A. trying to make it, but she was born and raised in Philadelphia. She would go home. This guy would find out that she was home, and he would always call her up for a hookup. And she would always go run to him and get laid and then feel awful after she had sex with this horrible guy. And one night, right before Christmas, she just decided to not go. And when she didn't go, she wrote that song. And then she came home, and she recorded it, and this girl that walked into the restaurant, she worked at a diner in Beverly Hills. This woman was a music supervisor for So You Think You Can Dance. And Christina said, look, I know who you are. And they had kind of struck up a friendly relationship enough. And she goes, I want you to hear my song. She said, I'll listen to it. She listened to it. She came back the next day and said, I'm putting this in my show. Christina did not have a label. She didn't have a manager. She didn't have anything. And she got on that, and that just took her career to the next level. But she wouldn't have been able to do that if she didn't write something that had absolute meaning to her.
Yeah.
So I think if that's my advice, that's my advice.
Write good songs.
Write good songs that mean something to you, know?
Yeah.
Just don't chase it.
I think that's solid advice.
Thanks, man.
All right. Well, thank you, Jason, for being on this.
Thank you, Sean.
I appreciate it.
Good luck with AMZY.
Everywhere I go, I see my shadow. Am I supposed to know where it's been before? And I don't wanna dig the ground to bury.
All right, there it is, podcast number 2 in the bank. I would like to thank our guest Jason Martin once again for coming on and sharing his secrets to the industry and having me over for dinner and drinks at his house. Thank you, Jason. And if you all enjoyed this podcast, please share with your friends and subscribe for future podcasts to come to stay updated and all that stuff. Thanks for listening.